Welcome back. Today we're going to talk about the ancient Greek underworld and a few different ways that the ancient Greeks understood the life after death or mortality in general. Here's a basic outline. We'll talk about the afterlife as it's presented in our earliest Greek literature, Homer's Iliad and Odyssey. The way other poets and writers discuss the ephemerality of human life, ways that people could be commemorated. We'll talk a little bit about the geography of Hades, the House of Hades, the underworld, and some of its more famous residents. The nature of that destination in the hero's journey, and then Plato's really weird take on the afterlife in Plato's Republic, the myth of Er. Here you see a crystal ring setting featuring Hades and Persephone. We know a bit about them. Yep, he's just grabbing her and running off with her. A little gropey, too. In Homer's Odyssey, we get to see the underworld, the House of Hades. It really doesn't have much going for it. Spirits flit about in the darkness, unable to talk. Odysseus has to give them blood to drink so that they can even speak to him and remember their lives. But notice that this is not a punishment. Being sent to the underworld, that's just the next step in life. You live your life and then you go off to be unimportant, insignificant, and forgotten. Very few people in the underworld are punished in any way. For everybody else, it's really just boring, a boring place. Compare that with the Christian or Muslim perspective that sees heaven as better than life. So Christian martyrs are rewarded for what they did. Lots of medieval people talk about the desire to die and be in heaven. So there actually has to be a ban on suicide. But the Greeks, like early Semitic cultures and the Hebrews, believe that death is just a bleak and shadowy existence where one barely retains a sense of self. Concurrent with the bleakness of death is the fleeting nature of life and the potential meaninglessness of everyday life. I mean, if we're all just going to end up in the underworld, what does our brief life mean? The Greek knowledge of the shadowy nature of Hades and the fleetingness of life combines to come up with ways to bypass the fact that mortals must die and that life is short and grim. Let's think about what Glaucus says to Diomedes in Iliad Book 6. Like the generations of leaves, the lives of mortal men. The wind scatters old leaves across the earth, and then new buds grow. Spring comes around again. So with men, as one generation comes to life, another dies away. So that's all we are, leaves falling from the trees. Mimnermus in the 7th century says the same thing, basically. We, like the leaves that come in the flowery springtime, we enjoy the blossoms of youth for a season, only a moment long. Pindar in the 5th century, the happiness of man grows only for a short time and then falls away to the ground, cut down by the grim reaper. What is man? Creature of a day, but the dream of a shadow. When a ray of sunshine comes, a brilliant light settles on men, and a gentle light. Okay, so Pindar's going a little bit beyond the idea that we're nothing. These poetic acknowledgments of the ephemerality of life can be read as bleak existentialism, but they can also be read as a call to life, a carpe diem siren song. We live so briefly, we mean so little, we might as well live it well, enjoy ourselves, something like that. And because you know that you aren't going to live on in any significant way in the afterlife, you find ways to live on through fame, through glory. So that could be the fame of being a great warrior. Hector says, "Someday one will say, one of the men to come, steering his oar-swept ship across the wine-dark sea, there is the funeral mound of a man who died in the old days, one of the brave whom glorious Hector killed. So they will say someday, my fame will never die." Hector, not even talking about himself, talking about how people will remember the people he killed in war when they see their tombs, and that the glory of Hector, his name will live on forever in that way. Pindar, 5th century Theban poet, writes victory odes for ancient athletes and talks about how the achievement of victory, winning the contests at the ancient Olympic Games, that will make your name last forever, your fame as an athlete. So kleos is something to be yearned for. And as we'll see when we look at the Iliad, Achilles knows he's going to die, but he knows that if he does, his kleos, his glory, will be aphthiton. His glory will be unwithering, immortality of a sort, not in body, but in reputation. So people believed that monuments would help them live on. Here we have a statue of a man, and inscribed on the base, "Halt and show pity beside the marker of dead Croesus, whom raging Ares once destroyed in the front rank of battle." I mean, I assume that he died in the battle, not that he's arguing. Somebody is telling us that Ares himself, the god, killed him in the battle. This is just a metaphor. He died in the front rank of battle, so he was one of the bravest fighters up there. And this statue will live on to show us what he looked like, I guess. But the Greeks will be the first to tell you that statues don't last forever. That for this one that has survived, hundreds, thousands didn't. So it's reputation and being sung in epic song that will guarantee you that sort of immortality. Certainly not statues. I hope you're familiar with Percy Shelley's Ozymandias, about the statue of a long-lost king whose name isn't even remembered. In a play that we're going to be reading later this term, Aeschylus's Libation Bearers, Electra gives offerings at the tomb of her father. "What should I say while I pour these offerings of sorrow? How shall I find gracious words? How shall I entreat my father? Shall I say that I bring these offerings to a loved husband from a loving wife, from my own mother?" Well, she's the one that killed him, so no. "I do not have the assurance for that, nor do I know what I should say as I pour this libation onto my father's tomb." So tombs were kept and given gifts to. If you lost a father or a spouse, you would every once in a while, maybe annually, maybe more often, pour gifts onto that tomb. Olive oil, milk, honey, maybe leave little cakes on the tomb as an offering to the dead. And Electra alludes to the idea that you can get benefits from them. So the dead might do something nice for you, but that's not a terribly common ancient Greek belief. Maybe your ancestors and loved ones are watching over you. Maybe they're not, but it's still nice to give them a little something. This monument was presumably erected in memory of the young long-haired girl who is holding her father's hand while her seated mother presents a bird to her little sister. So this is looks like an oil bottle, but it's marble, a marble tomb marker. Because the bearded man seated on a chair is the focus of the family scene, we assume that the monument was erected in his honor. So that's the dead dude sitting down, having his hand shaken. Oh, this one always gets to me. The gentle gravity of the child is beautifully expressed through her farewell to her pet birds, little pigeons. Her dress is unbelted and falling open on one side, revealing the way she's standing. Many of the most skillful stone carvers came from the Cycladic Islands, where marble was plentiful. The sculptor of this tombstone, the term is stele, this tombstone, was probably among the artists who gathered in Athens during the third quarter of the 5th century BCE to decorate the Parthenon. Back to the Underworld. Let's see. It's less about being down below us than just about being another world. It's sometimes considered beyond the edge of the world, as in the Gilgamesh epic. In the Odyssey, he heads out there by ship. The ship took us to the deep outermost ocean and the land of Cimmerians, a people shrouded in mist. The sun never shines there, never climbs the starry sky to beam down at them, nor bathes them in the glow of its lost golden rays. Their wretched sky is always racked with night's gloom. We beached our ships there, unloaded the sheep, and went along the stream of ocean until we came to the place spoken of by Circe. So Odysseus has directions from the witch Circe on how to get to the edges of the world to where you see the entrance to the underworld. Other entrances that ancients talk about, the Greeks and the Romans, are usually associated with volcanoes or marshes or nasty swamps. So various ways to get down there. The underworld geography is not all that coherent, but there are 5 rivers. Acheron, Lethe, Cocytus, Phlegethon, and Styx. The rivers of woe, forgetfulness, lamentation, fire, and well, Styx. Styx seems to be the most important in some ways. The Achilles is dipped into it as a baby in one of the stories, and anytime gods swear an oath by the river Styx, they cannot break it. This is how you get terrible stories like Zeus accidentally killing Semele. She made him swear an oath by the Styx that he would give her what she wanted, which was to appear in his natural form. Here's another listing of those rivers. The official outer boundary is the Acheron. This is where Charon, the boatsman, would ferry people across. And then the river of wailing and the river of fire. And Lethe. Lethe is where you drink from that river and forget your mortal life. And then, of course, Styx, whatever that means. In some versions, there are nicer and less nice places within Hades. So Elysium is where particularly awesome, notable heroes would have extra happy afterlives. Sometimes called the Isles of the Blessed, sometimes just the Plain of Elysium. But ordinary folks, they just flit about on the plains of Asphodel, wandering in a meadow forever. Asphodel. I'm not sure I get it. Some sources make it sound like asphodel shows up here because it's the only grayish flower the Greeks could think of, but it's also associated with funerals afterward. So I don't know if that's a chicken or egg issue. Was it a funereal flower before or after it was envisioned here? You'll recall Tartarus from the Theogony, the deepest pit where titans and giants are thrown. How does Hesiod describe it? They overshadowed the Titans, and they sent them under the wide-pathed earth and bound them with cruel bonds. As far under the earth as the sky is above. That's how far down from earth it is to Tartarus. So Hesiod is definitely picturing an underworld that is under the world, that it's down below and it's a deep, deep pit. Here's an example of Asphodelus albus, the white asphodel. That is kind of a bleak looking flower, isn't it? All grays and creepy tendrils. But in the Odyssey, we hear that Menelaus will not die exactly. But for you, O Menelaus, it is not ordained that you die and meet your fate in horse pasturing Argos, but the deathless ones will send you to the Elysian fields at the end of the earth, where life is easiest for men. No snow, no storms, no rain. Always the ocean sends up breezes. And the west wind, the nicest of the winds, refreshes men. For you have Helen to wife, and you are son-in-law of Zeus. So because of his connection to divinity, Menelaus will live in the Isles of the Blessed rather than in Hades proper. Or the Elysian fields are part of Hades, and they're the nice part, and he'll be there. It's all a little fuzzy. So who lives in Hades? Some familiar people. Hades himself. His wife Persephone is there some of the time. They have a dog named Cerberus. Cerberus has 3 heads, as you know. And Hermes comes and goes because, remember, in his role as Psychopompus, he is the guide of souls to the underworld, so he delivers the dead. Some other figures we should get to know. I mentioned Charon, the boatsman, ferries people back and forth across the Acheron to get into the underworld. And there's that notion that you have to pay him. So in some ancient Greek cultures, you have to burn on the pyre, burn people with a coin for Charon, so that they can pay the boatsmen, or they'll just hang out by the river the rest of eternity. Those first three names, Minos, Rhadamanthus, and Aeacus, are sometimes described as the judges of the dead, when the dead are judged, which is kind of a late story, I suppose. Some other people who live down there, Hypnos and Thanatos, are supposed to be, that's the personification of sleep, Hypnos, personification of death, Thanatos, and maybe their brother, Morpheus. Morpheus is the god of dreams. So sleep and death are associated ideas. Sleep is what, like a little death, only not that French one. And maybe dreams come up out of the underworld. So dreams are insubstantial, like the rest of the spirits down there. Oh, I just had to show you another Rape of Persephone sculpture. So there's Hades grabbing Persephone and running off with her. This is Bernini's sculpture in the Borghese Gardens. Here's a close-up, just so you can see how really awesome some sculptors are. You can see his fingers pressing into her in the marble. And so in the underworld as well, we have some of the worst people who do get punished. Remember, most people aren't punished down there; they're just bored. But in the account in the Odyssey, we see some of the greatest offenders, like Titius, who attempted to rape Leto, the mother of Apollo and Artemis. And so Apollo and Artemis kill him, and in Tartarus he is stretched out and chained, and his liver is eaten and regenerated every night, just like Prometheus. So there's a vulture tearing into him. Not an eagle like Prometheus, a vulture. Tantalus is one of my favorites. He was really a buddy of the gods. We'll talk about him later this term quite a bit, I think. Friend of Zeus and all the others, he would have them over for dinner. And he decided either two stories. One, he stole nectar and ambrosia from the gods and gave them to his friends. The other story, to test the gods, he cut up his son Pelops into pieces, stewed him, and fed him to the gods. They recognized him immediately, well, except for Demeter, that's another story, recognized immediately that this was human kid casserole, and killed Tantalus and punished him in the underworld by trapping him in this place where he's always hungry and always thirsty, but he can't quite reach the fruit on the tree above him, and he can't quite reach the water in the river below him. So he is forever tantalized. Sisyphus decided to cheat death. He found a way to come back after death. He told his wife, "Please don't bury me. Don't give me any of the proper funeral rites." And so she didn't. She left his body out. He complained to Hades and Persephone, "My wife didn't bury me. Let me go back and yell at her for it." And they said, "Okay." And he went back and just stayed with his wife for quite a bit longer. Eventually, death catches up with him. But because he was trying to do the impossible, fighting against necessity and trying to fight death, he's punished forever by having to push a boulder up a hill. And every time, just as he's just about to get to the top, it rolls back down. Did I mention this guy on Hera Day? Ixion. He wanted to rape Hera, and Hera knew it was coming, so she made a fake image of herself out of fog. His punishment in the underworld is to be tied to a big four-spoked wheel, although I think it's 6 spokes in this image. And why does he have bird wings? This is one of the more confusing images from the underworld. So as we barely make out from this bronze Etruscan mirror, Ixion has been made into a yunx, into a love charm. So the ironic punishment for falling in love with the Queen of the Gods is that he is made into this little bit of weird magic. There was a love charm in the ancient world where you take a certain type of bird, tie it to a wheel with 4 spokes, and spin it around while saying the name of the one you're in love with, something crazy like that. So here he is, a bird tied to a spoked wheel and spinning around in the underworld forever. The underworld is also terribly important for the heroic journey, and you see some of the most famous heroes make a trip down to the underworld and come back as part of their achieving demigod status and semi-immortality. You may be thinking of Heracles, how his 12th labor is to go to the underworld and fetch a 3-headed dog and come back. Odysseus, of course, you read the account of his visit to ask some questions of the dead. We talked about Dionysus as somebody who dies and comes back in a significant way. But there are some new ones. Orpheus we'll talk about in just a minute. Theseus, legendary king of Athens, goes to the underworld with his friend Pirithous so that they can kidnap Persephone. Persephone sees this coming, has them sit down to have a cup of tea, and they become stuck to the chairs. They're not able to escape until Heracles, on his way to get the dog, sees Theseus down there and pulls him out of the chair. He's not allowed to rescue Pirithous, who I guess is still stuck in the underworld. Theseus was pulled off without his butt, so partial buttocks still stuck to the chair. Maybe this is a story about why he didn't have much of a back porch. And anthropologists will make a connection to the description of the harrowing of hell in the First Peter book. What do I read in here? After being put to death in the fleshly realm, he made it alive, but made alive in the spiritual realm. In that state, he also went and made a proclamation to the spirits in prison, who in the past were disobedient, when God patiently waited in the days of Noah, etc. So Jesus dies and goes down to hell and comes back. Odysseus' description is one of the more interesting. So he travels northward across the river ocean to Earth's boundary to get to Hades, parallel, obviously, to the Gilgamesh epic, where he travels to the land where Utanapishti lives at the edges of the world. Even though in Gilgamesh, Enkidu tells Gilgamesh that the underworld is just a worm and mildew infested dungeon where all the souls live, he heads off to the far edges of the earth, and so does Odysseus, where he has to dig a pit, fill it with blood and wine and honey and milk and barley water. Ooh, that's significant. Why is he there? He needs to consult Tiresias to find his way home, but he meets a bunch of the other souls in the underworld. He meets Agamemnon. He's kind of surprised by that. He didn't know that Agamemnon had been killed by his wife when he got home from the Trojan War. But he knew Achilles was dead, and he honors him. He says, "No one, Achilles, of all men past or yet to be born, has been more blessed than you. We Greeks gave you honor equal to that of a god. And now that you're here, you're governing the dead." And Achilles says, "Oh, BS. Don't tell me about death, Odysseus. Better to be a servant of a servant on a tiny, poor farm, a man who is landless and hungry himself, than to be ruler of all of these pointless, shriveled up dead people." So does Achilles regret his choice? Maybe. I mean, this undoes everything in the Iliad, in the Odyssey, when he says, "Oh, I made the wrong choice. I should just be alive. That's all that matters." We've spoken a bit about Orpheus already, how he's the greatest mortal singer or semi-mortal singer, how his wife dies and he goes to the underworld to get her back. I wanted to share another version of that story from Virgil's Georgics. In Virgil's poems about farming, his Georgics, he's actually more concerned with Aristaeus, the ancient hero of beekeepers, than with Orpheus, but he tells a beautiful version of the story of her death. First of all, running from you in terror and splashing her way through a stream, the poor girl, fated to perish, failed to see that a monstrous viper lurked in the long, thick grass on the bank just over the river. And then poor Orpheus is just inconsolable. He only has his lyre to make him feel better. And finally decides to go down to the underworld, where he gets permission to take her back. On the way out, when at last his prayer was granted, Orpheus, shunning ill luck, was preceding his newly recovered Eurydice up to the light. Eurydice followed behind him, for thus Proserpina, that's Persephone, had ordered. But just as she came in reach of the fresh sweet wind of the heavens, madness seized the incautious lover. Forgivable, yes, but only if death knew how to forgive. He halted his step, forgetful, besotted by love, and turned around in his folly back to his bride just before Eurydice entered the daylight. And so we lose Eurydice. Perhaps in part for this heroic journey to the underworld and back, but perhaps because he's just famous as the first great mythological singer, Orpheus becomes associated with a series of myths, really a mystery religion that we call Orphism as a result. It seems to have started around the 6th century BCE, when teachers of this religious practice claimed Orpheus as the originator of a series of special teachings about death, because he would have special knowledge of it, having been to the underworld and back. A bit like the Eleusinian mysteries, this is a cult that is supposed to make you that is supposed to save you, that is supposed to give you a comfortable life after death. It's written down only in fragmentary forms, including gold leaves like this picture. It seems to be a variation on the Theogony story. The first principle was time, and from that came chaos and darkness and Aether, the light air. There's an egg. Time forms an egg inside the air, from which phanes comes, an obscure figure just meaning appearance. Phanes bears night. Night begets the earth and the sky. And after that, it's basically the Hesiodic version. A new important god in all of that, of course, is Zagreus, son of Persephone and Zeus, who later becomes Dionysus. It's in the story of the Orphic Mysteries that we get the story of Zagreus being torn apart by the Titans, and how Zeus hits all of those Titans with thunderbolts until they're just ashes, and then makes mankind out of the ashes that remain from them. Really, I don't want to sound like we know a whole lot about Orphism, because it's preserved so sketchily on these tablets, and even what we do have is shrouded in mystery, I guess intentionally. But there is some kind of rite of passage, an initiation. A young man approached by older men is killed and then brought back to a new life in the adult world. And it seems to be connected to some notion of reincarnation, of metempsychosis, which we'll talk about more coherently in the myth of Er today. So the Orphic tablets seem to be giving some kind of instructions for the afterlife, or for being reincarnated, or something like that. Among the alternatives to Hades, probably the most interesting is not really a Greek belief, but a myth made up by Plato to explain some things philosophers need to know. So let's run through the myth of Er. Kind of a confusing translation, not very easy to picture. I'll try to make it coherent. First of all, here's our outline. I'll talk about who Plato is, the nature of the Republic and who's talking, the general concept of reincarnation, who this dude is, and his experience in the afterlife, his geography of the underworld, quite different from Hesiod's and everybody else's, and then what heroes he sees while he's there. We have semi-secure dates for Plato, 427 to 347 BCE. Lived in Athens, was known to have spent time with Socrates, just one of the punks who hung around with that crazy old man. But his philosophy is definitely influenced by a few philosophers who were around before Plato and Socrates. He founds a school called the Academy, named for the neighborhood that it's in, basically, the grove of Academus, an old cult hero. So our word academy comes directly from an obscure hero's name, Academus. Plato wrote dialogues. He doesn't write a systematic, coherent philosophy. He just wrote dialogues where people are talking to a crazy old man named Socrates, and they figure things out along the way. But along the way, he examines and defines many important philosophical ideas. The theory of knowledge, the theory of ideas, which people refer to as a theory of forms, the nature of justice, the nature of the soul, a lot on what makes a good ruler, especially in the Republic. So what is the Republic, or Politeia in Greek? It's his longest work, a 10-book dialogue about the ideal state, ideal rulers, justice, and how the human soul relates to ideas of justice and the state. So who's speaking? Socrates. What can I say about Socrates? He's a tricky figure because he was a real-life dude, but he didn't write anything. We don't know that he said any of the things that Plato says he said. Basically, we know that he was a cranky old dude who hung around downtown Athens, kind of bothering people, stopping important people on the street and questioning them about what they know, trying to get them to admit that they don't know anything. I guess my favorite of Plato's dialogues is called the Euthyphro. Euthyphron is a priest who bumps into Socrates when he's on his way to have his father prosecuted for a crime. And Socrates says, "Wow, you must really understand the gods if you would do this to your father, if you know that what you're doing is right." And Euthyphro says, "Well, of course." And then within just a few pages, Socrates makes it clear that Euthyphro can't possibly know what the gods want, what the gods think, what is right, what is wrong, through what we call the Socratic method, or elenchus is the Greek term, the question and answer, cross-examination, and just basically verbally beating somebody down until they admit that they had no leg to stand on in the first place. The other characters speaking in the Republic are less interesting than Socrates. A couple of his followers, maybe that's too strong a word, some of the children of some of the most noble and wealthy houses of Athens like to hang out and hear Socrates berating people. So among them, Plato doesn't show up in his Republic, but Glaucon and Adeimantus do. There's a guy named Cephalus. He's a metic, a resident alien in Athens, an immigrant from Sicily. And his son Polemarchus, who's something of a philosopher, who runs a shield-making factory down in the port town outside of Athens. There's a sophist called Thrasymachus. Notice that I'm distinguishing between philosophers and sophists. Philosopher is just somebody who thinks about things. Sophists are paid to educate people rhetorically and logically and sophistically. Kind of a negative term throughout much of Plato. So what is metempsychosis, or the transmigration of souls? You're probably more familiar with the term reincarnation. So it's a form of immortality whereby a spirit goes from one life into another. Some people see reincarnation as human to human. In Plato, animals become human, human become animals, etc. Plato, in creating this myth, was probably influenced by Orpheus and Orphic doctrines, but certainly also by Pythagoras of Samos. You're familiar with Pythagoras for his triangles. He is also the head of an ancient philosophical and religious movement called Pythagoreanism. They believed in an afterlife where people were rewarded or punished, and they believed in reincarnation. There's a great story about Pythagoras seeing somebody beating a dog, and he ran up and said, "Stop! I recognize that dog. He was a friend of mine who died and came back as that dog." He also wouldn't let his followers eat beans because he felt that beans must have souls. Why did he think that? Beans have a certain spiritus in them. I think I'll leave it at that. So in this story, we have a guy named Er. He's the son of Arminius, a native of Pamphylia, killed in a battle, but 10 days later, his body hadn't decomposed. And when they went to burn him, he woke up and told the story of what he had seen. A brave Pamphylian man called the son of Arminius, who once died in a war. When the rest of the dead were picked up 10 days later, they were already putrefying, but when he was picked up, his corpse was still quite fresh. He was taken home and preparations were made for his funeral. But on the 12th day, when he was already laid on the funeral pyre, he revived and told what he'd seen. What had he seen? Um, Two adjacent openings in the earth, and above them two openings in the sky, and between them judges. They render their judgment and order just people to go upward into the sky and unjust people to go down through one of the holes in the ground. When Er came forward, they said, "Wait, no, you don't go on. You should report everything that you see here back to humans so that they know what the afterlife is all about." He said that he saw souls departing after judgment through one of the openings in the heavens and one in the earth, while through the other two, souls were arriving. So people go into the ground tunnel or the sky tunnel, and then they come back out. From the door in the earth, they came out covered in dust and dirt. From the door in the sky, they came out pure. And so they told their stories to one another, the former weeping as they recalled all they had suffered and seen on their journey below the earth, which lasted 1,000 years, while the latter, who had come from the sky, told how well they had fared and about the inconceivably fine and beautiful sights they had seen. So we figure out that everybody goes through a punishment or reward tunnel for 1,000 years, and the rewards and the punishments are paid tenfold. This is where Plato's narrative gets a bit confusing, the geography. The universe is imagined as a giant spindle, a spindle, the kind used to make threads into yarn or fibers into threads or something like that. I read a translation once that changed it to an upside-down umbrella, a long shaft in the middle and round parts revolving around it. It might be better to picture. The round parts are the orbits of the heavenly bodies around Earth, so 8 layers, all the stars, then a bunch of planets, and the sun and the moon on the whorl. The hell is the whorl? A whorl is part of the spinning process. It's the weight used to apply pressure to the threads or fibers being spun into yarn. So the thread dangling from the spindle connects to the orbits of the celestial bodies. The spindle is the center point of everything, and these are the spinning parts that you see in the sky. Here's another artist's version. Much clearer, maybe not, but it doesn't really matter for us. But take a note of the 3 women at the bottom turning their orbits. These are the fates. These are the 3 women, goddesses, women, who are responsible for doling out human fate. But they're not exactly the fates we're used to elsewhere. In Hesiod, and in just about every other ancient writer, the fates are the daughters of night. So they're an early primordial set of beings. They use the metaphor of weaving for what they do. Clotho, whose name means the spinner, she spins and makes the threads of life. Lachesis, whose name means the apportioner, she applies these threads to individual people. And Atropos, which means the unturnable, the unturnawayable, she cuts the threads and is responsible for the end of life. So they're the weavers. In Plato's account, the Moirai are the daughters of necessity, Ananke. Necessity is an abstraction that doesn't appear in Hesiod, or maybe does. Not very important, but sort of a baseline idea that some things are inevitable. Here, Lachesis comes first, distributing lots for lives to be chosen. So everybody gets a ticket, and they go in order, and everybody gets to choose their own lives. Clotho, the spinner, then allots each one a daimon, or a guardian spirit, guardian angel. And then Atropos is the one who takes them to the river Lethe to drink and forget everything so that they can start their new lives fresh. Let me pause for a quick moment to discuss the fates and Ananke, necessity. The Greeks believed that the gods were powerful, but not omnipotent, not all-powerful. They could not change the dictates of fate, whether that was expressed by the Moirai, the fates, or by the general notion of fate or necessity. There's a moment in the Iliad where Zeus's son Sarpedon is about to die. He muses for a moment that it would be nice to be able to save him, and all the other gods lose their shit. They round on him and say that what he just said is dangerously unfair. If he can save his son, then they should all be allowed to save theirs, and there'll be anarchy. Zeus basically replies that he was just joking so that they can just calm down. He acknowledges that fate, like with a capital F, cannot be changed once it's been woven out in the pattern. In the tragedy Prometheus Bound, Prometheus is explicit about this and tells the chorus that he'll eventually be freed, but he can't be freed yet because, fate. Even the gods, even Zeus, cannot change what is fated. The chorus asks, can it be that Zeus has less power than the fates do? Prometheus, yes, in that he cannot escape what is foretold. Oh, back to the fates. In the myth of Er, Lachesis speaks to the dead souls. Ephemeral souls, this is the beginning of another cycle that will end in death. Your daimon, our guardian spirit, will not be assigned to you by lot. You will choose him. The one who has the first lot will be the first to choose a life, to which he will then be bound by necessity. Virtue knows no master. Each will possess it to a greater or lesser degree, depending on whether he values or disdains it. The responsibility lies with the one who makes the choice. The god has none. So each of the dead souls, in the order based on the number on their ticket, gets to choose reincarnation into any living thing. Notice models of lives were placed on the ground before them, far more of them than there were of souls present, and there were all kinds, for the lives of animals were there as well as the lives of humans. And the choice is theirs. And so we see some dumb choices. And this is why this appears in a work of philosophy. Plato wants to make a point about how we choose our fates, or why we make the choices we do. And so he breaks the narrative a little bit and says, now it seems that it is here, Glaucon, that a human being faces the greatest danger of all. And because of this, each of us must neglect all other subjects and be concerned to seek out and learn those that will enable him to distinguish the good life from the bad, and always to make the best choice possible in every situation. And so the first chooser, the guy with lot number 1, screws up. The one who came up first chose the greatest tyranny, so he chooses to be a powerful king. In his folly and greed, he chose it without adequate examination and didn't notice that, among other evils, he was fated to eat his own children as part of it. Good old Greek myth stuff. He was one of those who had come down from heaven, having lived his previous life under an orderly constitution, where he had participated in virtue through habit and without philosophy. So there's Plato and philosophy. It's not enough to be a good person out of habit, because then you're going to screw up eventually. If you don't have a real philosophy to back up why you're a good person. And so he sees a bunch of famous mythical figures. I guess the timing is about right. If they had lived 1,000 years ago, then they've been going through their punishments or rewards. He saw the soul that had once belonged to Orpheus choosing a swan's life, because he hated the female sex because of his death at their hands, and so was unwilling to have a woman conceive and give birth to him. Apparently, sorry about this, apparently the Greeks believed that swan eggs come out of the male swan. And so there's a little screw up there. But you can see Orpheus choosing a beautiful songbird. Well, the Greeks seem to like the sounds that swans make. I find them just repugnant and horrible. It's like a sick goose. But the Greeks liked it, so Orpheus becomes a songbird. The 20th lot, he came forward and chose the life of a lion. It was Ajax, son of Telamon, Ajax from the Iliad. He avoided human life because he remembered the judgment about the armor. So Ajax, not in the Iliad, but in before the fall of Troy, gets in a fight with Odysseus over who gets Achilles' armor. Odysseus gets it. Ajax goes nuts and kills all the sheep and then himself, cursing all of the Greeks for doing him wrong. And so he doesn't want to be a human again, so he chooses to be a lion. The next one, same thing. Agamemnon had some sufferings, which we'll read all about. He didn't like the human race anymore, so he became an eagle. Maybe my second favorite is Atalanta. She was somewhere in the middle of the lots, and there was an athlete life that she could choose. So she chose to be an athlete, because ancient Greek athletes had to be men. Poor Atalanta, the great huntress and warrior, had never really gotten the glory that men get. So she makes the choice to come back as a man, as a winning athlete who's going to be honored for the sort of accomplishments that she had. And then Odysseus goes last. He chose the short straw. Since memory of its former sufferings had relieved its love of honor, it went around for a long time looking for the life of a private individual who did his own work, and with difficulty it found one lying off somewhere neglected by the others. He chose it gladly and said that he'd have made the same choice even if he'd been first. I don't know if that's a moment of like sour grapes, or if Odysseus is being given a lot of credit here for realizing that most of his sufferings were because of his high station, and maybe he should just be a regular dude in his next life. And so that's what he chooses. Kind of rounding out the story of Er and what he saw in the underworld, and maybe making one of Plato's points in his philosophy. Anyway, that's it for today. Thank you much.